Right, hello, welcome to this new lesson. Again, we are going to take a look at the methodology on how to write an essay before switching to the lesson, to today's lesson. So, first, what you should keep in mind is that you must be extra careful not to do an economic lesson in your essay. That's something that you tend to do, a lot of you, and you're right in a way, because you are expected to be experts, specialists in your domain, economics, sociology, political science, etc. And you need to show that, all your skills, all your knowledge, but up until a certain point, okay? What is difficult for you is that you need to find what we could call the middle of the road approach, okay? Don't go too far to the idealistic ideas and points of view, and don't go too far to the complex economic lessons and economic mechanisms that you tend to do also. Okay, you need to find a compromise. If I go back to what some of you did during the last Concours Blanc, for example, some of you had to work on universal basic income. Okay, universal basic income. When you know what it is, when a state, when a government gives the citizens money, free cash money, okay, free hands out. Some of you decide to go for a binary plan, advantages, disadvantages, or economic consequences, social consequences. That is maybe too binary, because inside you are doing an economic lesson. And some of you decide to start with the economic lesson and explain and be an expert and tell me about some economic laws and mechanism again. You need to find the perfect compromise between that, between the two approaches. So how do you do that? Well, remember, if that may help you, remember that the content, what you write, what you actually write, the content must always be dictated by your examples. Okay? You must always be referring to concrete situations, concrete examples, to the global trends in the world and in the English-speaking world, notably. The global context. Okay. So, for example, when you dealt with universal basic income, all of you, I think, said that it's for people over the age of 18. Okay, that's interesting. But you need to make something out of this information. Okay, so if you said that it's good for the young because you get money every month or every year when you turn 18. That's good. And that's good also for the poor. So the poor and the young, well, who's in that situation usually? The students. Okay? So when you say that universal basic income would be good for the young people, try to think of a concrete example. Try to make a link, for example, with the issue, the problem of student debt. Okay, you can say that it's good because, or one of the characteristics of UBI, Universal Basic Income, is that it benefits the young over the age of 18 and the poor. And usually in these two situations, at the joining point of these two situations, you find the students. Okay, so you can say that it may help reduce students' debt. Okay, it may help students to live comfortably. All right. When you say that one of the disadvantages, one of the negative consequences is that it may discourage unemployed people from going back to the job market and trying to find a job. Right, it's true. Okay, it's one of the possibilities. Again, try to link that with a concrete situation. Right, so people won't be looking for a job. If you want to defend universal basic income, you can say that in the future, and it's a trend, it's an ongoing trend, a current trend. It is well known that a vast majority of the jobs that humans do today will be automated. Okay, humans will be replaced by machines, by robots in their job. So, if you lose your job because a robot takes your place, how do you make a living? Well, you can say that universal basic income is a good idea to anticipate future problems on the job market, because we will need to find a way to make money, and perhaps this new way could be a universal basic income. Okay, so you are not dependent of your job, of the job market. So and what is produced, okay, the money earned by the robot. Robots don't need money. So what is produced, the gain, is invested in this universal basic income. Okay, so you said, right, it may discourage people from going back to the job market, but going to the job market will be increasingly difficult, and so we need a new way to make money, and maybe that the money produced and earned and gained through robotic work, as we can call it, may be invested in UBI. Alright? Also, thinking of the job market and maybe the disappearance of the job, if you have a certain degree of financial stability because of thanks to the UBI, maybe you will try to find a part-time job, okay, because you don't need to work as much, perhaps. Well, maybe you can say that it will change the way we currently perceive success in life, okay, because working hard is a central value, and in the text that accompanied this question, there was a case, an example of the possible end of a typical job, from a 9-to-5 job. So yeah, maybe it's the end of the working man as a hero. Maybe we can say that we start recognizing that it causes psychological damage. Okay, and today one of the main psychological trend is to recognize that mental health is a problem, and so universal basic income allows people to work less, and so to concentrate on other things in life, and it changes the way we perceive success, and it allows us to focus on psychological problem, mental health, etc., etc. Okay? Well, all of this is if you defend universal basic income. Now, if you are opposed to that, there are many things that you can say, okay? And you see in your examples and the way you link definitions of and characteristics of the UBI and the example that you use, you are giving your opinion, and it will be easier to conclude, okay? So, if you are opposed, you can say that, and you should write down and learn all these examples. You can say that since the 1980s, the American state of Alaska is offering a basic income to the citizens of the state. Okay? In the USA, this socialist measure exists in one of the most conservative state in the USA. Alaska. Alaska, you know that, is a big, massive oil producer, okay? And the state of Alaska makes money on this production. And so it's been decided in the 1980s that all the citizens, adults, but also the children, would be paid a dividend, okay? A dividend from the state's oil revenue. For example, in 2018, it was $1,600 every year, a check, okay, of $1,600 every year for all the citizens. So, as you can imagine, it may sound good because it leads to the reduction of poverty in the state, but it's been noted that there was no reduction of inequalities, because everyone gets the same amount of money, so the inequalities that existed continue to exist. Okay? So no reduction of inequalities between people, no effect on unemployment. Okay? It didn't change anything for the employment rate. It merely increased the fertility rate. That's all what changed. People had the money, so they had more children. Is it worth it? You can also mention some initiatives in Kenya and in India, two countries which implemented some form of basic income. But not universal, because it was not exactly for everyone and for the whole country. So you can say that in Kenya and in some parts of India, some states of India, it was decided to give money to people, but not by the government. It was decided by an alliance of the UNICEF and Google. And so, because it's not decided by a government, it is not democratic measure. Okay, the people don't have, the locals, the citizens of India and Kenya don't have the control over the amount of money, the frequency of the income, etc., etc. So there is a big democratic deficit because it's been imposed by supranational entities like private business, Google, and UNICEF organization, NGOs. Okay, so whether you are in favor or opposed to the measure, it's the same. Explain the characteristic of the measure, but always link that to a situation. Okay, you are judged on the examples that you give. That's important. Okay, so be careful. Right, let's move on to the second part of our work today. This week you had to work on a version. Okay, it's an extract from an article published in Politico, and the main idea behind this article was to introduce us, to present us a theory, a model by a social scientist. And the theory is that democracy only works if people are intelligent and responsible. So democracies don't work because democracy needs patience and work, okay, dedication and patience. Two qualities that allegedly, supposedly, two qualities that people don't have anymore. And that's why, according to the scientist Sean Rosenberg, democracy cannot work any longer. So the idea is that people tend to ask for easy and quick solutions. But of course it's a theory. Don't take that for granted, right? So the problems with the democratic process today would be that some institutions are outdated. Okay, think of the electoral college in the USA, for example. It takes time before before making a decision. Okay, by the time that the two assemblies, the two legislature discuss, amend the projects, the draft legislation, it takes too much time, and so the decisions come way too late usually. Okay, and also that there's a need to make compromise. Okay, except if you have an overwhelming majority in parliament, you need to make compromise in your legislation. So it's never satisfying, never really satisfying, and people don't like it. The majority of people don't like it. So if this democratic process is not satisfying, what are the possibilities? So Sean Rosenberg in this text explains that the future will be mostly comprised of populist governments from the left or from the right. It's the same populist governments having easy solutions for anything. But is it the only solution? No. If the democratic process doesn't work, maybe the people, the citizens, can get this power back. Okay, power to the people again, as they said. So what can population do? Let's try to answer quite quickly. Let's try to answer the following question. Should people be more involved in democracies? Should people be more involved in democracies? That could be the question asked in an essay. And maybe it will not be that exact question, but it will mention participative democracy, activism, radicalism, populism again, okay? And all these key words around the notion of the people, the citizens and democracies and making democracies alive, etc. So, I'm repeating the question. Should people be more involved in politics? Let's try to think about it and rephrase it. Should people be more involved in democracies? If we ask the question, it means that people are not involved in democracies, or not enough. So perhaps the people should be consulted more often. Okay, people are not involved because we don't ask them questions. Well, for that question, I refer you to the lesson from last week's lesson on the previous question, do elections still matter? Okay, we're trying to move in circles, to move on in circles here. So maybe people are not consulted enough in our democracies. But if they are consulted, are their opinions respected? Again, last week's lesson brings answers to that. And finally, and that's the novelty here, that's new, if elections don't matter, if the people's opinion is not respected, how can the people be heard outside the democratic process? How can the people be heard outside the democratic process. Okay, so what I think would be interesting here is to answer this question with two different sub-questions. Okay, first, do elections still matter? We've done that already. And two, how can the people be heard outside this process of elections, outside the democratic process? So, first, are elections an illusion of choice? Well, for some people in the UK, after 2016, after the Brexit referendum, some people may have felt cheated. And I'm talking about the supporters of Brexit, the Brexiters. Because right after the vote, when it was decided that the UK was going to leave the European Union, some people, the Remainers, said, no, we should vote again. And this opinion appeared 4 years ago, or 3 years ago, and it was still something, it still existed in the debates up until last January. People said, Remainers said, we should vote again. But the people who voted in favor of Brexit, they may feel cheated, okay? Think about when France and the people of France and the people of Netherlands felt when in 2005 they voted no to the Treaty of Lisbon. It's the same. They decided on an opinion and then people said, no, well, okay, that's your opinion, but we're going to do it anyway. Or you decide on Brexit, but yeah, it doesn't matter. We are going to do what's right, what we believe is right for the country. You may think that you are being cheated, okay? So, elections may seem to be an illusion of choice. Think also about the American Electoral College in the USA. Yes, in 2016, Hillary Clinton, the Democratic candidate, got 3 more million votes. It was the same in 2000 when George W. Bush was elected. He had less votes than the Democratic candidate Al Gore. So maybe people are being cheated, maybe the institutions are no longer up to date. And also, as we said last week, there are in some countries too frequent elections, and it's always the same political parties, and they proved inefficient, and they may have let the citizens down, as some people think. Okay, and sometimes the political decisions taken during the mandates, okay, are very different from the promises of the campaign, okay, from what was promised in the party platforms, okay, and also in some countries there are coalitions, there are alliances between political parties to remain in charge, to be in government, and so again compromises, middle of the road approaches, okay, and it goes against the will of the people. And we know that people today ask for more radicalism, okay? They want decisions to be taken. For example, in the USA and in Europe too, people want a Green New Deal. Some people want a Green New Deal. Right. But you know that after talks and debate in Parliament, the end will not be radical. Okay, the final text will not be that important and radical. It will be a middle of the road approach. So people are disappointed. Okay, and so there is a rise. At the same time, as politicians are perceived, increasingly perceived as inefficient, well, activism is on the rise. Okay, it goes at the same time. Okay, politicians lose credibility, and people try to act by themselves, for themselves. Okay, and that's a rise of activism and sometimes radicalism. So you may think of all the recent examples in activism, and especially activism from youth. Okay, young people. Think of Nobel Prize Malala Yousafzai, who committed to fight for education, girls' education especially, but education in general. Think of Greta Thunberg, of course, okay? And think of all the fights, the social change that some people need and want and demand today. Climate justice, okay? Climate justice. Racial equality, gender equality, LGBTQ rights, economic change, and many, many others. Plenty of others, okay? So, first, definition. What is an activist? An activist is someone, I'm giving you the definition from the New York Times. It's quite interesting. An activist is someone who feels an urge, okay, a desire, an urge to rebel against the current reality, okay? Someone who needs and wants change. In other words, on the short term, it's a person who wants social and political reform, okay, social and political reform. And on the longer term, on the long run, on the long term, it's someone who wants to achieve an alternative vision of society. Someone who has a plan, who has an idea on how society should be, what it should look like, okay? And someone who fights, who acts to get to this reality. Okay, to this alternative reality. But how does it work? Usually, the most frequent way of being an activist is to go on strike and to demonstrate. Okay, and I'm putting in the description of the video some vocab, some words and expressions that you absolutely need to know and to use. So, demonstrations and strike, is it successful? Well, not anymore. It has been. It has been at the beginning and maybe during the first part of the 20th century. But since then, think about the end of the 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s in the USA, during the Vietnam War. There was this counterculture, the hippie movement, okay? Was it successful? No. The war continued, okay? It started under a Republican presidency and it ended with a defeat under a Democratic presidency. But the war continued, okay? You may also think of 1979, the year when in the UK Margaret Thatcher came to power, okay, and you know she remained in power for 11 years, Conservative Tory Prime Minister. Why was she elected? What's the primary reason? Well, it was a time of massive strikes in the UK, as you know. 1976. The UK had to go to the IMF to take a loan because it was almost bankrupt. It was bankrupt. It was bankrupt after a few years of strikes from the miners, the coal miners, and many other workers in factories and in the industry in general. Okay, and First, people voted for the Labour Party, okay, because the Labour Party was close to the trade unions. Some expression that you should know, the trade unions. But the Labour Party couldn't get an agreement, and so Margaret Thatcher arrived in power and decided to be tough, to be very strict, and to end the demonstration after 1 year of demonstration, okay, strike. And she ended the strike, and the miners got nothing in exchange, okay? So, again, demonstration and strikes unsuccessful. And again, another strike, another 1 year strike in 1984-85, and again, Margaret Thatcher, well, she resisted, and in the end, because of the increasing and the growing financial difficulties for the miners, they had to stop, and they got nothing. Okay, think of 1981, when Republican Ronald Reagan became the president. On the first day or second day of his presidency, he fired 11,000 air traffic controllers because they were on strike. Okay, on the second day of his presidency, he fired 11,000 people. So, you know, it's unsuccessful. We mentioned last week the students' protest in London in 2010 because of the cost of university. I mentioned that with the students from ECE2. You should watch the videos. So the students protested against the cost of university, but in the end, the reforms took place as expected. Okay, it was big in the media, but politically it was nothing. So, demonstrations and strikes are unsuccessful. You can choose any of these examples in your essays. Demonstrations and strikes are unsuccessful. People remain unheard, or they have the feeling that they are unheard. And they have the feeling that there is a lack of support from the general public. Okay? So it leads to frustration, of course, because it is frustrating not to be heard, not to be taken seriously. And so sometimes it leads to vandalism and violence. Okay? And so you lose more support from the public. And also, the problem for the politicians is that, well, people say, you are not useful because you are not listening. So there's a growing disdain for politics and politicians. So everyone loses, okay, in the end. So people decide that they must find a way to be heard. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, this activism turns to radicalism. One of the big stories of the year, so something that could be in your documents in the concours, in the exam. We've talked about it, but we need to insist on it. One of the big stories this year was Extinction Rebellion. Remember that? That's why I'm talking about radicalism and activism, because it's one of the main stories of the year, and so it can be, it is one of my favorite subjects for this year exams, okay? Extremism in activism. One thing that may be interesting in your openings, perhaps, you should know that last January 2020, the UK and the terrorism police in the UK decided to add Extinction Rebellion, this association, this movement, to add them to the list of extremist ideologies, okay, extremist groups of the country. So they are along, and they are in the same list as some neo-Nazis associations and pro-terrorist Islamic groups, for example, okay, like ISIS, the Islamic State. They are in the same group because they are seen as a threat to national security, okay, and it might seem bizarre, it might seem strange, because they are very different, actually, whether you like Extinction Rebellion or not. They are different from the Islamic State, for example, okay? Because Extinction Rebellion is, at the core, it is a non-violent group, okay? They refuse violence. So they are not the same as neo-Nazis, alright? They only want to influence decisions, influence political decisions, okay, in favor of the fight against against climate change, okay? So it uses what we call civil disobedience. Civil disobedience, as you know, is refusing to obey some laws in the country. So, okay, that may be a national threat, but they are non-violent. So, what is happening with Extinction Rebellion? Okay, that's something that you should keep in mind. Very important. You can open an essay saying that last January, Extinction Rebellion joined a list, were put on a list of extremist ideology with neo-Nazis and the Islamic State. Why is that? Well, the media described the group, the movement, as extremely dangerous, okay? And why is that? Well, Extinction Rebellion tried to reinvent ways to be heard by the politicians, okay? The strikes are not working, the demonstrations are not working. So, as you know, they glued themselves physically, they glued themselves to official buildings. They tried to paint, in the UK, they tried to paint official buildings with fake blood, okay? So, they tried to be visible and to be heard by being original and provocative, okay? And they want to cause disruption, maximum disruption. So, as you can see, there is a change, there is radicalism in actions, but there are also radicalism in demands, what the groups, what the associations, what the people demand. And I refer you to what we've discussed when we studied in January, when we discussed the decade, the 2010s. Remember that? It started at the beginning of that decade, in 2010, 2011. It was the time of the Arab Spring, it was the time of Occupy Wall Street, etc., etc. So it was the beginning of a new activism, of a return to radicalism that was lost, okay? So you should mention that, okay? These historical information. And so you may also perhaps question the causes. Why? Why a new radicalism? Well, politicians don't listen to the people, but also economic precarity, growing inequalities, climate change, okay, and the fears that accompany climate crisis and political crisis and geopolitical crisis, etc. Okay, it's not that different from radicalism 100 years ago. Okay, for example, if you think of the 1910s, people were also furious at the brutality of changes on the job market, okay, the brutality of all the ending process of industrialization and geopolitical tensions, of course, before and after the war, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so In conclusion, because I gave you more examples than ideas, I understand, let's try to sum it up. There are flaws in the electoral process, okay? You've got many examples. Flaws in the electoral process, people are not heard democratically in the elections. Think of Brexit, think of Clinton and Trump election in 2016, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so there are new ways that are there are other ways to be heard. More strikes, more demonstration. That's point number 2. Okay, but it doesn't work. It hasn't been working since the beginning of the 20th century, and you can think of demonstration against the Vietnam War, Margaret Thatcher, I repeat myself, but you need to keep that in mind. Thatcher, the students' protest against the cost of university in London in 2010, etc., etc., etc. Okay? So, electoral process is not working. Old ways to demonstrate are not working. So, you need to develop new ways to demonstrate, be original, to do actions that are important and visible and seizable in the age of social media, for example, and the image, okay, images everywhere. So fake blood, sit-ins, so to glue yourselves to an official building. So all these things that if you take a photograph of the situation, if you take a picture, it will go viral on the internet, right? And Extinction Rebellion is a good example of that, because they are the ones today trying to reinvent the way to act. Okay? This is the summary, and if you want it in a final way, another way to put it, you can say that if you follow the guidelines and the traditional ways of protesting, you are unsuccessful. If you are innovative, you are a national threat. And so, in the end, you need to put your trust, your confidence in politicians. But is democracy really efficient today? That's a question that you can leave open. It's good to end on the question. And so, I'm leaving you on that question. Are democracies really effective, really efficient today? If you want to answer that question, you can write your essay and send it to me in an email. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them to me. If you want all these examples that I gave written, you can ask for that too, and I'm putting the vocab in the description. Alright? Thank you for listening. I'll see you very soon for the correction of the version, and that's a goodbye.